The morning began like any other for Lena. She woke up before her alarm went off, the soft light of dawn filtering through her thin white curtains. For a few quiet moments she lay still, watching the gentle dance of light on the ceiling. Outside, the city was slowly coming alive. The distant hum of cars, the sound of a bicycle bell, someone calling out to a neighbor. It was ordinary and peaceful, just the kind of morning she liked. Lena lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers, neat, warm, and filled with small touches that made it feel like home. A few photos on the shelf, a potted plant by the window, a half-read book on the table. It was the kind of space that gave her quiet comfort, especially after long, tiring days at the hospital. She was a nurse, and her work could be overwhelming. Most days she came home exhausted, her mind still replaying the faces of patients she had helped or couldn't help. But today she had a few free hours before her shift began. That simple thought made her smile. She decided she would take a long walk in the park, breathe some fresh air, and let her mind rest before heading back to the noise and rush of hospital life. After a quick shower, she tied her hair into a loose ponytail, slipped into a light gray jacket, and grabbed her bag. The air outside greeted her with a crisp coolness. It was early autumn, the kind of morning where you could still see your breath if you exhaled slowly. The trees were beginning to change color, golden, orange, and red leaves scattered across the grass. The world smelled faintly of rain and earth. The park wasn't far from her building. As she entered the path lined with tall maple trees, Lena felt a calmness she hadn't realized she needed. Birds chirped softly from the branches. A few people passed by. A man jogging, an elderly woman walking her small brown dog, a couple sitting quietly on a bench. Everything felt slow and simple. Lena walked toward the small pond at the center of the park. The water shimmered with the morning light, and the surface reflected the soft movement of clouds above. She loved this spot. It was where she often came to think or to simply sit in silence. She found an empty bench nearby and sat down, crossing her legs and pulling her jacket a little tighter. From where she sat, she could see the playground on the other side of the path. A young mother was there with her baby, pushing a stroller back and forth while talking on her phone. The baby, dressed in a tiny blue hat, waved its arms happily, kicking its legs and giggling at something unseen. The scene made Lena smile. She couldn't help but think how fragile and beautiful life could be. In her line of work, she saw people fighting for every breath. Yet here, under the morning sun, everything seemed safe and perfect. It was a moment she wanted to hold on to. She closed her eyes for a while, letting the sounds of the park fill her ears, the wind rustling through the leaves, the faint laughter from a child, the soft creak of the swing. It was peaceful, almost like time had slowed down. Then something changed. It was faint at first, a strange splash, followed by a startled cry. Lena's eyes shot open. She turned toward the pond, her heart quickening. The stroller that had been near the path was no longer upright. It had rolled toward the edge of the pond, its wheels half sunken into the mud, and then tipped forward into the shallow water. For a moment, everything around her went silent. Then instinct took over. Lena jumped from the bench and ran. She didn't think, she just moved. Her shoes splashed through the wet grass as she sprinted toward the pond. The young mother screamed, dropping her phone and running too, but Lena reached the edge first. The stroller was face down in the water. Lena didn't hesitate. She waded in, her shoes filling with cold water, her jeans soaking instantly. Her hands grabbed the handle and pulled hard. It was heavier than she expected, but adrenaline gave her strength. She dragged it toward the bank, gasping as the muddy water splashed up her arms. "Hold on," she muttered, half to herself, half to the tiny life trapped inside. When she finally got the stroller upright on solid ground, her fingers fumbled with the straps. They were tangled, slippery, refusing to open. She could hear the baby's faint cries, muffled but still there, and that sound gave her focus. "Come on. Come on," she whispered desperately. The young mother was crying beside her, trembling, repeating, "Please, please," over and over. Lena managed to release the final buckle and lifted the baby out. The child's small body was wet, cold, and gasping for air. Without thinking, Lena wrapped her jacket around the baby and held it close to her chest. The baby coughed, sputtered, then let out a loud, sharp cry, strong and full of life. It was the most beautiful sound Lena had ever heard. She felt her chest tighten, not from fear but from overwhelming relief. "It's okay," she said softly, though her own voice shook. "You're safe now. You're okay." The mother took the baby from her arms, crying harder now, but these were tears of gratitude. She kept saying thank you over and over, clutching her child close. A few people who had seen what happened ran over to help, offering tissues, jackets, and comforting words. Someone called an ambulance just to make sure the baby was fine. Lena stepped back, her heart still racing, her hands shaking slightly. The cold water soaked through her clothes, but she barely felt it. Everything seemed distant, like she was watching from outside her own body. Then she heard it. The baby's soft whimper as the mother rocked back and forth, whispering to calm her. That sound hit Lena like a wave. It wasn't just a cry, it was a memory. For a moment, she wasn't standing in the park anymore. She was somewhere else years ago, surrounded by flashing lights and broken glass. She saw her younger sister's face, pale and frightened, and the faint sound of a baby crying in the background. The air around her seemed to vanish as her chest tightened. She blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. The sound of the ambulance siren snapped her fully awake again. Paramedics were arriving, checking the baby, assuring the mother that everything was fine. Lena stood quietly, trying to steady her breathing. The mother turned to her, eyes filled with tears, and whispered, "You saved my baby. I don't know what I'd have done without you." Lena tried to smile. "I'm just glad you're both okay," she said softly. But deep down she could feel something inside her shifting. Something she had locked away for years now stirring to life. She didn't understand why saving this child had shaken her so deeply. It was supposed to be simple. She had done what anyone would do. Yet as she stood there, dripping wet, surrounded by strangers, she felt like she had just opened a door she'd spent a long time trying to keep shut. The sirens faded into the distance as the ambulance left. The park slowly returned to its calm rhythm, though the air still carried traces of what had happened. The quiet whispers, the concerned looks, the scattered footprints in the mud. Lena sat back down on the same bench, her jacket heavy with water, her hands still trembling slightly. She stared at the rippling surface of the pond, where the morning sunlight now danced gently again as if nothing had happened. For a long while, she didn't move. She just watched, her thoughts spinning between the calm of the present and the shadows of her past. She didn't yet know why this morning felt different, or why the sound of that baby's cry echoed so painfully inside her. All she knew was that something deep within her had been stirred, a memory she could no longer ignore. And though the day had only just begun, Lena sensed that what happened in that park was only the beginning of something much bigger. The sirens had long faded, but Lena could still hear them echoing in her head. The park had gone quiet again, though for her nothing felt quiet inside. The sound of that baby's cry replayed again and again, each time stirring something deep in her that she couldn't name. She walked home in silence, her clothes damp, her shoes squishing softly with each step. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the air, but she couldn't shake the cold. Her hand still trembled slightly, as if her body hadn't caught up to what had happened. At home, she changed into dry clothes and sat on the edge of her bed. Her apartment felt different now, too still, too empty. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the floor, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't the first time she'd faced an emergency. She'd seen people on the edge of life and death countless times at the hospital, but today had felt different. Today had hit something personal. She made a cup of tea, hoping it would calm her nerves. As the steam rose, she found herself lost in thought. She tried to push the memory away, the one she had spent years avoiding. But the harder she tried, the clearer it became. She remembered the sound first, the screech of tires, the shattering glass, the deafening silence that followed. She was younger then, barely in her 20s, driving home with her sister after visiting their parents. It was supposed to be a happy day. They had laughed in the car, singing along to a song on the radio. And then everything had gone wrong in a single second. The image of her sister's face flashed before her eyes, smiling one moment, gone the next. Lena had tried to save her, tried everything she could, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. The only thing that had survived that crash was her sister's baby, saved by a stranger who had pulled the car door open before it was too late. She never knew who that stranger was. She never even said thank you. She had been too broken, too lost in guilt to think about anything else. That day had changed her life. It was the reason she became a nurse, the reason she threw herself into helping others. Maybe deep down she thought saving lives could make up for the one she couldn't save. Now, sitting alone with her tea, she realized how easily the past could come crashing back. All it had taken was a stroller, a splash, and the sound of a crying child. Lena sighed and glanced at the clock. She was late for work. She grabbed her bag and hurried out, trying to shake off the heaviness inside her. The hospital was busy, as always. The moment she stepped inside, she was surrounded by noise. Patients talking, monitors beeping, footsteps echoing down the halls. It was comforting in a strange way. Here she knew what to do. Here she had control. Rough morning? Her coworker asked as they passed each other in the corridor. You could say that, Lena replied with a small smile. She didn't explain. Some things were too heavy to put into words. Her shift passed in a blur of tasks and routines. She checked patients, updated charts, comforted families. Yet no matter how busy she kept herself, the image of the baby in the park wouldn't leave her mind. She could still feel the weight of that tiny body in her arms, the desperate relief when it cried. When her shift finally ended, she walked out into the cool evening air. The sky had turned golden, the sun dipping low behind the buildings. She thought about heading home, but found her steps turning instead toward the park again. She didn't know why. Maybe she just needed to see it, to make sure it was real, that it wasn't just some strange dream her mind had created. The park was quiet now. The playground was empty, the pond still and calm. The same bench she'd sat on that morning was there, and for a moment she just stood looking at it. The world around her seemed peaceful again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She sat down slowly, her thoughts heavy. What if she hadn't been there? What if she'd decided to sleep in or take a different route? The thought made her shiver. She didn't believe much in fate. But something about today made her wonder if life sometimes placed people in the right place at the right time for a reason. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? A soft voice spoke on the other end. Hi, is this Lena? You were in the park this morning? Yes, Lena said slowly. This is the mother of the baby. I wanted to thank you again. I got your number from the paramedics. I hope that's okay. Lena smiled faintly. Of course. How's your little one doing? She's fine, the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. They checked her at the hospital. She's perfectly healthy. I can't stop thinking about what you did. You didn't even know us, but you didn't hesitate. I'm just glad I was there, Lena said softly. There was a pause. Then the woman added quietly, You saved her life. Lena didn't know how to respond. She murmured a quiet goodbye, hung up and sat in silence, the phone still in her hand. The gratitude in that woman's voice filled her with warmth, but also an ache she couldn't describe. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories blurred together. The park, the pond, the crash, her sister's face. She got out of bed and walked to the window, staring at the city lights flickering below. She realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She missed her sister. She missed her laughter, her warmth, the way she used to hum softly when she was nervous. For so long, Lena had tried to forget, thinking it would make the pain easier. But maybe forgetting had only made the wound deeper. She sat by the window until the first light of morning crept into the sky. Somewhere inside her, a quiet thought formed. Maybe this was her second chance to face what she had buried. Maybe saving that baby wasn't just about luck. Maybe it was life's way of telling her it was time to stop running from her past. The next day at work, she couldn't shake the thought. Between patients, her mind wandered. She remembered how the baby had looked. The small blue hat, the way its tiny fingers had clutched her jacket. The details wouldn't fade. That afternoon, she found herself dialing the number that had called her. The woman picked up almost instantly. Hello, Lena said, her voice soft but steady. It's me again. I was wondering if I could see you both, just to know how the baby's doing. There was a pause, then a warm answer. Of course. We'd love that. A few hours later, Lena found herself standing outside a small house not far from the park. She hesitated before knocking, her heart pounding. When the door opened, the woman smiled at her, holding the baby. dry, warm, and smiling this time. "She's fine now," the woman said proudly, lifting the little girl slightly. "Would you like to hold her?" Lena nodded. The moment the baby was in her arms again, she felt that same rush of warmth and something deeper, something like healing. The baby looked up at her, eyes wide and curious, as if recognizing her. "She really likes you," the mother said with a gentle laugh. Lena smiled, tears forming quietly in her eyes. "She's strong," she whispered. "She's going to be just fine." They talked for a while, sharing tea, stories, and small laughter that came easier than Lena expected. When she left, the sun was setting again, casting golden light over the street. She felt lighter somehow, as if a small piece of her heart had finally begun to mend. That night, before going to bed, Lena sat at her desk and pulled out a small wooden box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were photos, her family, her sister, and one of a baby with big, curious eyes. She ran her fingers over the edges, smiling through her tears. Maybe life had a strange way of bringing things full circle. Maybe she had been meant to be in that park, to hear that splash, to save that child. Because in saving that baby, she had started to save herself too. She looked out the window one last time before turning off the light. The city was quiet again, but for the first time in years. Her heart wasn't, it was awake, and deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of what she had yet to face. Lena woke up earlier than usual the next morning. The soft gray light of dawn seeped through the curtains, and for a few seconds she lay still, unsure if she had really slept at all. Her mind felt heavy but restless, like it had been running through memories all night. She turned to look at the clock. It was barely 6. The world outside was still quiet, only the faint sound of birds somewhere in the distance. Normally she would have pulled the blanket over her head and tried to catch another hour of sleep, but something inside her wouldn't let her. She got up, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. Steam curled up from her mug, fogging the glass slightly. She stared at the city below, the streetlights flickering off one by one, people beginning to move about their day. Everything looked so normal, yet inside her nothing felt the same. Saving that baby had stirred something she couldn't name. It wasn't just pride or relief. It was a deep ache, the kind that came from old wounds reopening. She had spent years keeping her past locked away, telling herself she had moved on. But now it was like the lock had broken, and all the memories she'd buried were flooding back. She tried to push them aside, but they clung to her, her sister's laughter, the smell of her perfume, the terrible sound of the accident, the guilt that had followed. It had been years since that day, yet the pain felt fresh again. She got ready for work slowly, almost mechanically, as if her body was on autopilot. When she reached the hospital, the familiar chaos greeted her, the buzzing phones, the squeak of stretchers, the hum of conversation. Normally this noise grounded her, but today it only made her feel like she was drifting further away from herself. "Hey, you okay?" her coworker asked as they walked together down the hall. "Yeah," Lena said, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." Her coworker nodded, not pushing further, and they went their separate ways. The day passed in a blur again. Patients came and went. Names were written on charts and machines beeped rhythmically. She did her work well, but part of her mind was elsewhere. Every time she heard a baby's cry from the maternity ward, her chest tightened. Every time she saw a worried mother holding her child, she had to look away for a moment to breathe. When her shift ended, she went outside and stood in the parking lot for a long time. The sky was turning orange, the kind of evening that made everything glow softly. She could have gone home. She should have gone home, but instead she found herself walking, without really knowing where. Her feet carried her back toward the same park. She told herself it was just to get some air, to clear her head. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. Something was pulling her there. The park looked different in the late light. Children's laughter filled the air and couples strolled along the paths. She walked slowly, scanning the faces without meaning to. Part of her was hoping, though she didn't know for what exactly. And then she saw them. The young mother from that day was sitting on a bench near the pond, gently rocking her baby. The sight made Lena's heart skip. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but the woman looked up and spotted her first. "Oh, Lena," she called with a warm smile. "You came back." Lena smiled shyly and walked over. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again." "Of course I do," the woman said. "You're the reason we're both here today." Lena sat down beside her, looking at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The tiny blue hat was gone this time, replaced by a soft white one. The child's face was calm, rosy, full of life. "She looks stronger," Lena said softly. "She is," the woman replied. "I still can't believe how lucky we were. If you hadn't been there..." Her voice trailed off and she looked down at her daughter. "I don't think I could ever thank you enough." "You already have," Lena said gently. There was a long, quiet pause. The breeze stirred the trees, sending a few golden leaves tumbling around their feet. The woman smiled faintly. "You know, I didn't even get to tell you our names that day. I was too shaken to think straight." "I'm Clara, by the way." Lena nodded. "Nice to meet you properly, Clara." "And this little one," Clara continued with a proud smile, "is Ava." The name caught in Lena's chest. She swallowed hard, trying not to let it show. Ava. That had been her sister's baby's name, too. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she forced a small smile. "It's a beautiful name." "Thank you," Clara said, adjusting the baby's blanket. "It was my grandmother's name. She passed it down through the family." Lena froze for a moment, the air suddenly feeling heavier. Her grandmother had been named Ava, too. She stared at the pendant hanging around Clara's neck, a small silver locket in the shape of a heart. It looked strikingly familiar, almost identical to the one her sister used to wear every day. "Your necklace," Lena said quietly. "It's beautiful." Clara touched it with a gentle smile. "Thank you. It's a family piece. My mom gave it to me when I had Ava. It's been in our family for generations, or so she says." Lena felt the world tilt slightly. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "What's your mother's name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Rose," Clara replied. "Rose Bennett. Do you know her?" Lena's breath caught. Rose Bennett. That was her mother's cousin, the one her family had lost contact with years ago after moving to another city. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Everything inside her went quiet, like the world had paused. Finally, she managed a small nod. I think we might be related." Clara blinked in surprise. "Really?" Lena nodded slowly, her voice soft. "My mother's name was Evelyn Bennett. Rose is her cousin. I remember hearing stories about her when I was little." Clara's eyes widened. "You're kidding. That means..." She looked down at her baby and then back at Lena. "That means you and I are family." The words hung in the air like a fragile truth, something almost unbelievable. Lena sat back, her heart pounding. She had come to the park just to clear her head, and now sitting beside this woman and her baby, she realized fate had led her straight into a piece of her own past. "That's incredible," Clara said after a moment, smiling in amazement. "I had no idea. I mean, what are the chances?" Lena smiled faintly, still dazed. Maybe the chances were meant to be. They sat together for a long while after that, talking quietly. Clara told her about her family, how her mother had moved years ago and lost touch with some relatives. Lena listened, every word feeling like a small bridge between the past and the present. When the baby stirred, Clara rocked her gently, humming a soft tune. It was a lullaby Lena recognized, the same one her sister used to sing. The melody wrapped around her heart, both comforting and painful. "You have a beautiful voice," Lena said quietly. Clara laughed softly. "Oh, this old thing? My mom used to sing it to me when I was little." Lena smiled, though tears pricked her eyes. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew that song had been passed down the same way, through family, through love, through time. As the sun began to set, Lena stood up to leave. "I should go," she said softly. "I'm so glad I saw you both again. Please come visit any time," Clara said sincerely. "You're family now, and not just because you saved us." Lena nodded, her throat tight. She walked away slowly, her heart full but heavy. The wind rustled through the trees behind her, carrying the faint echo of that lullaby. By the time she reached her apartment, the sky was deep blue, the first stars blinking faintly overhead. She stood at her window for a long time, watching them. So many years she had run from her past, afraid to face it. And yet somehow life had brought it back to her, not to hurt her, but maybe to heal her. She whispered softly to herself, almost like a promise. Maybe this was never an accident. For the first time in years, Lena didn't feel haunted by her memories. She felt connected to the present, to the baby she'd saved, and to the sister she had lost but would never forget. And as she turned off the light and got into bed, her heart felt a little lighter. Somewhere out there under the same sky, a baby named Ava was sleeping peacefully, and that she thought was enough for tonight. The next few days moved slowly for Lena. She went to work, came home and tried to carry on as usual, but her thoughts were never far from the park, from Clara, and from the baby she had saved. She couldn't shake the strange, warm connection she felt to them. Every time she thought about that moment, about hearing the name Ava, her chest tightened with something she couldn't quite describe. At the hospital, her co-workers noticed the change in her. She smiled more now, though sometimes she drifted off in thought during quiet moments. One of the doctors even teased her gently, saying she looked peaceful but haunted. He wasn't wrong. One evening, after a long shift, Lena stopped by a small cafe near the hospital. It was nearly empty, and the warm smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air. She sat by the window staring at the reflection of the city lights in the glass. Her hands wrapped around the cup, seeking comfort in its warmth. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara. "Hi, Lena. Hope your day went okay. Would you like to come by this weekend? Ava would love to see you." Lena smiled softly at the message. She hesitated for only a moment before typing back, "I'd love to." That Saturday, the sky was bright and clear, the kind of blue that made everything look softer. Lena walked to Clara's house carrying a small stuffed bear she had picked up from a shop on the way. It was simple but sweet, with a tiny bow around its neck. Clara greeted her at the door with a wide smile and a warm hug. "I'm so glad you came," she said. The baby was in her arms, giggling as soon as she saw Lena. "She remembers you," Clara said, laughing. "She doesn't smile like that for everyone." Lena held out her arms, and Clara handed her the baby. The little girl clutched at Lena's finger, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. Lena laughed softly, feeling her heart melt all over again. They spent the afternoon talking, sipping tea, and sharing stories about their families. The more they talked, the more pieces of their family history began to connect. Clara showed her old photographs of relatives, some that Lena recognized instantly, others she had only heard about through her mother's stories. "This is my grandmother," Clara said, pointing at an old black-and-white photo. Lena leaned closer, her heart skipping. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my grandmother, too." They both stared at the photo for a moment, the realization settling in deeper. It wasn't just a coincidence. They were truly connected by blood. Clara looked up, her eyes shining. "It's like fate wanted us to meet." Lena smiled faintly, her throat tightening. "Maybe fate has a funny way of fixing what time breaks." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe." Later that afternoon, as the baby napped in her crib, Lena and Clara sat in the living room with soft music playing in the background. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room in warm gold. "You know," Clara said after a pause, "I always wondered about the family my mother lost touch with. She used to talk about her cousin Evelyn. She said she was kind and strong. She wished she hadn't let distance come between them." Lena's heart ached at the sound of her mother's name. "She was kind," she said softly, "and strong. She passed away a few years ago." "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered. Lena smiled gently. "Thank you. It was hard, but she lived a full life. She always believed everything happens for a reason." They fell into a comfortable silence. The house felt peaceful, the kind of peace Lena hadn't felt in years. She watched as a ray of sunlight landed on the baby's toy on the floor, its small shadow swaying with the breeze. Then, out of nowhere, Clara said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you have any siblings?" Lena hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. For a moment she thought about changing the subject, but something in Clara's warm, curious eyes made her answer honestly. "I did," she said quietly. "A sister. She passed away a long time ago." Clara's expression softened immediately. "I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Lena said, though her voice trembled slightly. "It was an accident. A car crash. I was driving. She was only 24. The words hung heavy between them. Clara reached out, gently placing her hand over Lena's. "That must have been unbearable." Lena nodded slowly. "It was. I blamed myself for years. I still do sometimes. She had a little girl, my niece. She survived the crash because of a stranger who pulled her from the car before it caught fire. I never found out who that person was. Clara squeezed her hand gently, her eyes full of empathy. You did everything you could. Sometimes things happen that we can't control. Lena nodded again, her gaze distant. I tried to move on. I became a nurse because I wanted to save people. Maybe I thought it could make up for that day. She let out a shaky breath. But when I saved your baby, when I heard her cry, it felt like I was back there again. Like my past was standing right in front of me. Clara's eyes glistened with quiet understanding. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stood and came back with a small photo album. She flipped through the pages, stopping at one. You should see this, she said, handing it to Lena. It was an old picture, faded and yellowed with time. It showed a young woman holding a baby, smiling under a tree. The woman looked strikingly familiar. That's my mother, Clara said softly. And this is me when I was a few months old. Lena stared at the photo, her heart racing. The woman in the picture wasn't just familiar. She looked almost exactly like her sister. The same soft eyes, the same gentle smile. Her breath caught. She looks like your sister? Clara finished gently. Lena nodded, unable to speak. They sat in silence, both lost in thought, both feeling the weight of something bigger than coincidence pressing down on them. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever think that maybe the people we lose, they find ways to come back to us? Lena blinked away tears. Sometimes, yes. Maybe not in the way we expect, but yes. Clara smiled faintly. I think my mom used to believe that too. She said love doesn't end. It just changes shape. Lena looked down at the photo again, then at the baby sleeping peacefully in the other room. Maybe that's true, she whispered. Maybe saving her wasn't just about saving a life. Maybe it was about finding a peace of mind again. The rest of the afternoon passed gently. They talked about memories, about family, about the strange ways life seemed to weave connections that didn't always make sense until much later. As the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in orange light, Lena stood to leave. Clara hugged her tightly. You're welcome here any time, she said softly. You're part of our family now, in every way that matters. Lena smiled, her eyes shining with tears. Thank you. You have no idea how much that means. Walking home that evening, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from finally accepting. She stopped by the park again, the same spot where everything had begun. The pond reflected the fading sky, calm and quiet. She sat on the bench listening to the rustle of leaves, thinking about how strange life could be, how one moment could shatter everything, and another could start to put the pieces back together. She closed her eyes and whispered, If you can hear me, I hope you know I'm okay now. The wind picked up gently, brushing her hair against her face. It almost felt like an answer, and for the first time in a long time, Lena let herself smile, not the practiced kind she wore for the world, but a real one that came from deep inside. She knew there were still things left unsaid, feelings she hadn't fully faced, but she also knew she was ready now. Ready to face the past, ready to forgive herself, and ready to let life move forward again. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the little girl named Ava, sleeping somewhere across town surrounded by love. She thought about her sister, her mother, and the strange way life had brought her full circle. Maybe it wasn't about erasing the pain. Maybe it was about understanding it. Maybe that was what healing really looked like. And as she drifted into sleep, one thought lingered quietly in her mind. She had saved a baby that day. But maybe, just maybe, that baby had saved her too. The morning light spilled gently through Lena's curtains, warming her face and pulling her slowly from sleep. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply lay there, feeling the stillness of her apartment, listening to the soft hum of the city outside. Everything felt different now. Not louder or brighter, just clearer somehow. The past few weeks had changed her in quiet ways. She went through her days with a new kind of calm, one that came from finally letting go of something she'd carried for far too long. The nightmares that used to wake her in the middle of the night had faded. She could finally close her eyes and rest. At work, her co-workers noticed the difference. Her laugh came easier, her shoulders didn't carry the same invisible weight, and even her patients seemed to sense it. They smiled more when she walked in, and she found herself taking extra time to talk with them, to really listen. But beneath that peace, there was still something stirring, something unfinished. She couldn't quite explain it, but she felt a quiet pull as if life still had one more message to give her. One Friday evening, just as her shift ended, Clara called. Her voice was calm but filled with emotion. "Lena, would you come over tomorrow? There's something I want to show you." Lena agreed without hesitation. The next day, the weather was soft and gray, the kind of day that made everything feel slower. Lena walked the familiar streets toward Clara's house, her heart fluttering with quiet curiosity. She carried a small box in her hand, a gift for the baby, though part of her didn't even know why she'd chosen it. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny charm shaped like a heart. When she arrived, Clara opened the door with a warm smile. "Come in, I just made tea." The house smelled of cinnamon and something freshly baked. The baby was playing on a soft blanket on the floor, surrounded by toys, her small hands reaching for a colorful rattle. Lena sat down beside her, gently tapping the rattle. "You've gotten so big," she said softly, smiling. Clara poured tea and sat across from her. "You've been on my mind a lot," she began. "Ever since that day in the park, I keep thinking how strange it all is. How you were there at the exact moment we needed you." Lena nodded. "I've thought about it too. It feels like it was meant to happen." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe it was. But that's not all." She reached for a folder that was sitting on the table. "After you told me about your sister and her daughter, I couldn't stop wondering. I did some searching. Old records, family notes, even hospital archives." She paused. "And I found something." Lena's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Clara slid a photograph across the table. It was faded but still clear enough to recognize. A hospital room, a newborn baby in a nurse's arms, and standing beside her, Lena's sister, smiling through tears. Lena's hand trembled as she picked it up. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my sister." Clara nodded softly. "Turn it over." On the back, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "To the kind nurse who helped deliver my baby girl, thank you for being there when I needed strength." And underneath the signature, a name that made Lena's heart stop. Evelyn Harper. Lena's throat tightened. "That's my sister's handwriting." Clara nodded again. "The nurse in the photo. That was my mother." The room fell silent. The baby babbled softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment around her. Lena looked at the photograph again, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. "All this time," she whispered, "our families were connected in ways we never knew." Clara reached across the table, her eyes glistening. Maybe it was never about coincidence. Maybe it's something bigger. Maybe this was always meant to bring us back together. Lena wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. Maybe it was. The baby let out a joyful squeal, waving her little hands as if she could sense the warmth filling the room. Lena laughed softly, picking her up and holding her close. The baby reached up and touched Lena's cheek, her tiny fingers brushing away a tear. In that moment, something inside Lena settled completely. It was as if all the broken pieces of her heart had finally found their place. The pain, the guilt, the unanswered questions, they didn't disappear, but they no longer hurt the same way. They had transformed into something gentler. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking through old photos, sharing stories, and realizing how deeply their families' lives had been intertwined. Through kindness, through tragedy, through time itself. When it was time to leave, Clara walked her to the door. "You know," she said, "I used to think saving someone meant giving them another chance. but I think sometimes it means reminding them they were never really lost. Lena smiled softly. Maybe that's what we did for each other. Outside, the rain had started, a light drizzle that softened everything it touched. Lena walked home slowly, the photograph tucked safely in her bag. She felt lighter than she had in years. That night, she placed the photo on her dresser beside a small candle and a framed picture of her sister. For a long time, she sat there in the soft glow, staring at both photos side by side. She thought about the baby, about the laughter in that warm little house, about the love that had somehow survived years of distance and pain. She thought about how life had led her step by step back to the very thing she didn't know she'd been missing, a sense of belonging. As she reached for the candle, a faint smile crossed her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for sending me where I needed to be." In the quiet of her apartment, she felt it again, that gentle, unseen presence that had guided her all along. Not a voice, not a sign, but a feeling, a quiet assurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning, she returned to the park, the same place where everything had started. The air was crisp and the pond shimmered like glass. She sat on the same bench and looked out over the water, remembering every detail of that day. The sound of Clara's cries, the baby's first wail, the rush of adrenaline. But now the memory didn't bring pain. It brought peace. A young couple passed by, pushing a stroller. The mother smiled at Lena as they went. Lena smiled back, her heart swelling with something close to joy. She stayed there until the sun began to rise higher, warming her skin. Then she stood, brushed off her coat, and began to walk, slowly, calmly, toward whatever came next. Life would go on. She would still have hard days, still miss the people she'd lost. But now she understood something she hadn't before, that love, real love, doesn't end. It simply finds new forms, new faces, new beginnings. And maybe that was what fate had been trying to show her all along. As she reached the park's exit, she took one last look over her shoulder. The trees swayed gently, their branches dancing in the light wind. She smiled, whispered a quiet goodbye, and stepped forward into the day, no longer haunted by the past but carried by it softly, like a memory that finally found its way home. 3 years had passed since the day in the park, the day that had changed everything for Lena. Sometimes, when she thought back, it didn't even feel real. The memory had softened over time, like an old photograph that had begun to fade at the edges, but the warmth of it remained. She had moved to a quieter part of the city since then, near the edge where tall trees lined the streets and the air smelled faintly of pine after the rain. Her apartment was small but full of light, with plants by the window and a shelf filled with books and framed photos, reminders of the life she had rebuilt piece by piece. Every morning she still woke early. It was a habit she'd never broken, though now the early hours no longer felt lonely. She'd brew her coffee, step onto her small balcony, and watch the city slowly wake beneath the pink glow of dawn. It was her quiet ritual, a way to remind herself how far she had come. Her work at the hospital had changed too. She no longer rushed through her days as if trying to outrun her thoughts. Instead, she found herself slowing down, noticing the little things, the gratitude in a patient's eyes, the relief in a mother's smile, the soft weight of a newborn she helped bring into the world. People said she had a gift, a calmness that made others feel safe. She never thought of it that way. She just knew what it felt like to be scared, to lose, to find hope again. And maybe that was enough. Clara and the baby, little Ava, had become part of her life in ways she could never have imagined. What began as a strange twist of fate had turned into something like family. They met often, sharing dinners, birthdays, small celebrations, or simply quiet afternoons in the park. The baby she had once pulled from danger was now a bright, curious 3-year-old with curly hair and an endless laugh. She ran to Lena every time she saw her, calling her Lena Mama in her small, sweet voice. The first time she said it, Lena had cried quietly all the way home. Clara always smiled when she saw the two of them together. "She adores you," she would say. And Lena would smile back and reply softly, "She saved me first." One Sunday morning, Clara invited Lena to the park, the same park where everything had begun. The weather was perfect, Sunlight filtering through green leaves, children laughing in the distance, and a light breeze carrying the smell of grass and summer flowers. Lena arrived early and sat on the same bench by the pond. The water shimmered gently, rippling with the movement of ducks gliding across the surface. She smiled to herself, remembering that day, the fear, the rush, the miracle that had followed. She heard familiar laughter behind her and turned to see Clara pushing a stroller. Ava skipped beside her, clutching a red balloon in one hand. "There she is," Clara called out. Ava let go of the balloon, squealing as it floated up. "Lena, Mama!" she cried, running into Lena's open arms. Lena lifted her easily, spinning her once before settling her on her hip. "You're getting so big," she said, smiling. "Pretty soon you'll be taller than me." "No," Ava giggled. "You're too tall." They spent the morning feeding the ducks, talking and laughing. The conversation flowed easily, full of lightness and small memories. There was something about the park that always made them both feel grounded, as if it held their shared story gently within its trees and water. At one point, Clara looked at her and said, "Do you ever think about how one moment can change everything?" Lena nodded slowly. "Every day. I used to believe life was a series of coincidences. But now I think some things are meant to happen, not because we deserve them, but because they're meant to guide us." Clara smiled softly. "I think you're right. That day didn't just save Ava. It brought my family back to me and brought you back to yourself." Lena looked out across the pond, watching sunlight flicker across the water. "It did," she whispered, "in more ways than I ever understood." They fell silent for a moment, the quiet between them filled with gratitude. Then Ava tugged at Lena's hand. "Lena, Mama, can we play?" Lena laughed and stood. "Of course we can." They ran together across the grass, Ava's laughter echoing like music. Clara sat on a bench nearby, watching them with a soft smile, her eyes glistening as she thought about how life could be so unpredictable and yet so beautifully kind. When the afternoon sun began to dip lower, they packed up their things. Ava had fallen asleep in the stroller, her small hand still clutching the string of a new balloon Lena had bought her. As they walked toward the park's exit, Clara said quietly, "I've been thinking. I want Ava to grow up knowing her family, all of it. The ones who came before her, the ones who brought her here." Lena nodded. "She will. And she'll know she was loved by all of them." Clara looked at her with warmth. "You're part of that story too, you know." "You always will be," Lena smiled. "I know." When she got home that evening, Lena sat by her window with a cup of tea and watched the sun set behind the rooftops. The world outside was quiet, glowing in shades of gold and pink. On her table sat the framed photo of her sister, beside the one of Clara and Ava from their last birthday together. She picked up the photo of her sister and traced her finger along the edge of the frame. "You'd have loved her," she whispered. "You'd have loved them both." A soft wind blew through the open window, stirring the curtains. She closed her eyes, feeling it brush her skin, gentle, familiar, like a touch from someone long gone but never forgotten. After a while, she stood and took out her journal, something she hadn't written in for months. She opened to a blank page and began to write slowly, her handwriting small and steady. "It's been 3 years since the day everything changed. I used to think saving that baby was a miracle I gave to someone else. Now I understand it was a miracle given to me, because that day I didn't just save a life. I found my way back to living mine." She stopped writing, smiled softly, and added one last line. "Sometimes the heart heals not when you forget, but when you finally remember, and it no longer hurts." She closed the journal and looked outside once more. The first stars were beginning to appear, faint and patient against the darkening sky. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of her past pressing on her shoulders. Instead, she felt surrounded by it, not as a burden, but as a story of love, loss, and rediscovery, a story that had come full circle, and deep down, she knew that every choice, every twist of fate, had led her exactly here, to this quiet evening, to this peace, to this sense of belonging she once thought she'd never find again. Somewhere across the city, Clara was putting Ava to bed, whispering a bedtime story that started with, "Once there was a woman who saved a baby in a park." Lena smiled at the thought, her eyes soft with gratitude. The story would live on, not just as a memory, but as proof that kindness, even in one fleeting moment, could change everything. As the night deepened, she turned off the light and lay in bed, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she didn't dream of loss or fear. She dreamed of sunlight, laughter, and a baby's tiny hand reaching out, not for help but for love, and that was enough.